Before I go any further, I should caveat potentially with a warning that this particular chapter may be triggering. I'm going to get to the point that the abuse we're talking about here is sexual abuse. So if this isn't a topic that you're interested in hearing about right now, perhaps set this podcast aside for another time, or perhaps don't listen at all if it's something that you don't think would be a good story for you to hear. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dana Peever, decision expert, author, speaker, and podcast host. You're listening to the Wildly Courageous Women podcast. More women than ever are faced with challenging decisions on a regular basis. I am so privileged to sit down with them to discuss exactly what they've gone through and how they've come out the other side, realizing their wildest dreams. I'm sure you'll be able to relate. And don't forget to stay to the end to take advantage of my latest free gift. Let's get started. Hello, you wildly courageous women, you. Welcome to the Wildly Courageous Women podcast. I'm Dana Peever, decision expert, and as always, we're here talking about decisions that have been made in our lives that were courageous or impactful or changed the course of our life, or even one that we wish we could go back on. So each week, I join you twice, once with a guest and once solo. Today, I'll be sharing an impactful decision from one of my books. I'm doing things a little differently today. So since I've been studying the science of decision-making for over 30 years, the majority of my life's decisions have been made very intentionally using my 5-step Decision Smith system and app. And that goes for my clients as well. So today, I am going to read one chapter from my first book, and I'll make you aware if you don't already know. So this is my first book. It is called, and I'm trying to get it in the picture here, The Decision to Purge, the Year the Skeletons Fell Out of the Closet. So that was published back in 2020. And it's a compilation of stories from clients that I work with, women who made big decisions in their lives to move forward, to get through something. And rather than try and retell Stephanie's story, I thought I'd just read it. I believe that the impact of her decisions will land in listening to this chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and read. The chapter is called Stephanie, Her Can of Worms, and it's chapter 13 in The Decision to Purge. My conversations with Stephanie weren't long ones, nor did it seem agonizing for her to share personal information when she did. That was her personality. She got straight to the point and rarely overanalyzed situations until later. This discussion had started no differently. She didn't elaborate much. She didn't divulge a lot of information. I learned that Stephanie hadn't ever previously shared many of the details she was about to confide in me. Bits and pieces had been told to a select few over the years, but only her husband knew the bulk of the story. The abuse began when she was young, 7 or 8 years old, and continued for 3 or 4 years. And before I go any further, I should caveat potentially with a warning that this particular chapter may be triggering. I'm going to get to the point that the abuse we're talking about here is sexual abuse. So if this isn't a topic that you're interested in hearing about right now, perhaps set this podcast aside for another time, or perhaps don't listen at all if it's something that you don't think would be a good story for you to hear. I'm sorry I didn't caveat that sooner. All right. So again, the abuse began when she was young, 7 or 8 years old, and continued for 3 or 4 years. She doesn't exactly remember the timing and would prefer not to. Back then, Stephanie didn't tell anyone what was going on. She was too ashamed. It had begun the way that this type of abuse usually starts, with conversations about sex, how much she knew, what she had done. At that age, she laughed. it wasn't much. It was encouraging to see in her laughter that she had a light perspective about the whole situation, because the abuse was dark, full and complete penetration every time they were alone together, mornings, afternoons, evenings. It didn't matter the time of day. There wasn't any way she could avoid it, so it became easier for her to let him have his way and get on with her day. When she was easily agreeable, he would leave her alone until the next time. And there was always a next time. My heart was breaking for Stephanie, not only for what she had endured, but for the fact that her childhood and her innocence had been stolen from her, and at such a young age. As she recounted those early events in her life, I witnessed her struggle just once. I would soon learn that Stephanie's story was even more complicated than I had originally perceived. For reasons that were beyond her control, Stephanie's abuser was someone she would continue to encounter for many years after the abuse began. She was still reluctant to share many details. She did describe the disgust and impatience he exhibited each time she arrived wearing her apparel of choice, overalls. Easy access was impeded by the extra unbuckling of straps and subsequent clothing removal. Stephanie finally, but hesitantly, described a pivotal event when he asked her to follow him into the bathroom. Walking down the hall, she anticipated him taking advantage of her in his usual way, with everyone else out of earshot. But as she opened the door, there, on the floor in front of the sink, lay another male, naked from the waist down, whom she immediately recognized. Stephanie told me that she will never forget the image of him in the bright lights of the bathroom. Lying there with his penis fully erect, he searched her eyes, expecting her to willingly partake in the same activities that her abuser must have described to him. She admitted that was the first time she found the courage to turn around and run away. As disgusted as she was by that vivid memory, she described the fortitude that grew inside her that night, empowering her to refuse all future advances. It was definitely a turning point. Throughout her childhood and teenage years, Stephanie lived in self-stipulated silence regarding her abuse. She frequently found herself doing a double check for symptoms, but thankfully, none had emerged. Years later, she confronted her abuser in the parking lot of a bar they'd all been drinking at. She had been trying to understand the motivation behind what he'd done to her, so she came right out and asked him, why? His response was the one thing she couldn't have anticipated. He apologized. He said he didn't know why he had done it and admitted the memories had haunted him for years. He cried like a baby and begged Stephanie for her forgiveness. Calling on strength that most of us will never have to forge, Stephanie somehow accepted his apology. She chose to believe in the depth of his remorse and forgave him on the spot, promising that she would never reveal his identity. At that point in her story, Stephanie stated very confidently that she is completely at peace with this part of her past. I asked her how she knew. She told me that she has an incredibly hard time forgiving people for things they have done when they should have known better. But she remembers in that moment, standing in the gravel parking lot in the dark, feeling complete and utter forgiveness. She shared that in her years of reflection, she continues to reaffirm that his actions haven't affected her in the long run, in the least. She believes the ease with which she forgave him is the reason. She told me that as an adult, she's always enjoyed healthy relationships, never experiencing issues with intimacy or trusting people. She exudes high self-esteem and confidence. She never experienced the typical symptoms of sexual abuse. And until that year, she didn't believe any had emerged. It's ironic how the awful abuse of her childhood circled back to haunt her. Stephanie admitted that the reason it surfaced was as a result of her own mother. She told me that about 20 years ago, she had a phone conversation with her mom's mom. Her grandmother had shared with her that her mom wasn't in a very good place at the time, that she was struggling with issues from her past. Her grandmother had divulged to Stephanie that her mom had been sexually abused as a young child and had never had a chance to deal with it. Her grandmother suggested that it might be a good idea for Stephanie to give her mom a call. From past conversations, I knew that Stephanie and her mother shared a strained relationship, so I was curious to hear what happened next. Stephanie exclaimed that it was the last thing she could ever fathom talking to her mother about, but she called anyway. She told her mom that she had had a conversation with her grandmother and was wondering how she was doing. Her mom was a little shocked that such personal information had been shared, but went on to admit that it had happened a very long time ago. As was all too common, it had been one of her father's friends. The sad part was when she'd attempted to tell her parents about it, they hadn't believed her. Instead, they locked her secret in a closet where Stephanie's mother had kept it hidden and eating away at her all these years. So, how do you respond to that admission? I couldn't imagine how I'd react to a story like this. And Stephanie admitted that she'd had no idea either. She wound up choosing the first thing that came to her mind, which was, I know how you feel. She told me that her mother was aghast and retorted with, how the hell would you know how it feels? That was when Stephanie revealed to her, for the first time, that it had happened to her too. Her mother's knee-jerk and not atypical response was to accuse her of lying. She then immediately demanded to know who it was. But Stephanie said she'd never tell. He apologized, she added, and I forgave him on the spot. It hasn't affected my life. The next words that her mother spoke are ones that Stephanie still catches herself playing over in her head. Don't kid yourself, she said. You've got a can of worms inside you, and someday, when you least expect it, it's going to burst open. You just wait. Stephanie sadly recalls shaking her head in the moment, only a tiny bit surprised at her mother's reaction. She'd become used to most things being turned around to ensure her mother was the center of attention, but considering the topic, it left her feeling raw. Deep down, a very small part of her wished her mother could step out of the situation for just one moment to acknowledge the horror of what had happened to her daughter. Stephanie laughed at herself and wondered how she could still expect a typical motherly response after all the years of its absence. That's why Stephanie came to talk to me that year. With the residual effect from her mother's comments, she found herself continually doing that double check, even years later. Those words have haunted her. She regularly felt the need to look over her shoulder to ensure those worms weren't crawling up behind her. Despite her wisdom and the self-confidence that she worked hard to rebuild in the aftermath of the abuse, her mother's words still loitered in her head. She wondered how this long ago uttered threat, one born from her mother's own pain, continued to have such a profound effect. While it didn't happen right away, Stephanie ultimately made the decision to stop this cycle of self-questioning. As our conversation progressed, I was finally able to grasp more about the whole situation. Our discussion helped her come to terms with the way her mother's words had introduced fear into her own life. Stephanie eventually told me that she knew she was the only one who could stop it in its tracks. She was the only one who could change the tape playing on repeat in her head. Enough is enough, she had said. After all the years she'd spent questioning herself, Stephanie acknowledged the benefit of sharing the whole story with someone from start to finish. She had finally reached that point of vulnerability. Stephanie acknowledged, in no uncertain terms, that she ultimately accepted the issues her mother was projecting were just that, her mother's issues. She recognized that she'd already been able to deal with the past and that without the noise from her mother, that's where it all would have remained. The cathartic healing that sharing her story provided was just the antidote she needed to understand fully how to move forward. Her own issues had been dealt with. The only question she now faced was how to ensure her mother's words would never tear her soul apart again. At the end of our conversation, Stephanie admitted that she finally had the courage she required to move forward confidently. She had identified the factors that were important to her. She didn't believe this dark topic would come up again with her mother. It was no longer an option that she would entertain. And she knew that if it did happen, she would be prepared to deflect the pain and let her mother know, in no uncertain terms, that she should focus solely on dealing with her own can of worms. That was a pretty heavy chapter in that book. And I hope in listening to Stephanie's journey, you learned about her courage in facing the decisions that she had to make, not only as a child and as a teenager, but as an adult. I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. If you're ready to realize your wildest dreams, come and join us in the Wildly Courageous Women Facebook group, where we're changing people's lives one brave decision at a time. I'm Dana Peever. Until next time, make great decisions and do life fun. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Wildly Courageous Women. Keep listening to hear more stories of these incredible women realizing their wildest dreams. If you have a story to tell about a decision that you've made that has impacted your life, I'd love to feature you as a guest. Please get in touch and don't forget to grab my latest gift by clicking below. I'm Dana Peever. As always, make great decisions and do life fun.